but there are risks and challenges that are involved in decisions that we make about higher education. And we shouldn't just look at the rosy picture of going to college as being somehow or another a secret formula that's going to solve everyone's problems. The reality of the fact is that there's a lot of complications about going on to higher education. There's a lot that we need to think about. And our presenters today are going to present for us some insights with regards to why we should be concerned about this. So let me just say that when we ask the question, like, what is the return on a college degree? How do we calculate the value of a college degree? And sometimes we look at, do we get a job and does it have financial implications? And sometimes we say, does it enrich us as citizens and give us a greater perspective of the world of which we are part? College education does both of those things. But for many students, the concern and families, the concern is going to college going to enable me to get a job? Is it going to enable me to accumulate some savings? Is it going to enable me to have a better life and be a ladder out of poverty and perhaps a pathway to prosperity? So everyone needs to think about all of these factors as they make these choices. So let me turn to our presenters, and I'm going to ask first Dr. Emmons to lead the conversation, just to say a little bit about how you constructed the framework around which the study took place.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. First, for all three of us, I'll say we're speaking for ourselves and not necessarily the Fed. And secondly, we love Boston, but we're actually at the St. Louis Fed. And
the Boston Fed?
we work collaboratively with our colleagues in Boston and around the country. So the work that you highlighted is the result of a few years working on issues related to how families succeed, how they struggle, how they came through the financial crisis, and then the years of recovery following that. And the framework that we have been following is to look at what we call the demographics of different families, and that includes how old they are at a given time when we gather the information about them, what year or what decade were they born in, also the education levels of the respondent to the survey, think of as the head of the family. And to a limited extent, we've got some information also on the education of the parents of these adult respondents, and also the race or ethnicity with which the family or the individual identifies. So it's a broad-based approach, and it was pretty obvious pretty quickly that each of these dimensions is very, very important. But as you say, education is no doubt instrumental. It's fundamental in understanding why different families have higher incomes, why they accumulate more wealth or less. And also, we have, and many others have documented that it makes a big difference too in how families withstand shocks, things like the recession or the current recession that we're going through right now. It matters. These demographic factors line up with how people are able to make advancements in their own lives over their life cycles, and also intergenerationally, how their children do. So it's a very, tightly connected with a lot of these background factors. So that's kind of how we came to this, and this work really tries to put in high relief the differences. And I should say, this work was specifically looking at the dollars and cents, the incomes that families earned, how much wealth they'd accumulated, and the difficulty, of course, of this exercise is making fair comparisons. And so we wanted to compare families of the same age or the same generation, the same race or ethnicity. And so those are what you would think of as kind of the factors for which we're trying to control the differences that then could reveal, hopefully, what's the effect of education. So even though we wouldn't claim to have perfectly identified education as a causal variable here, we certainly would say that the correlations, the associations are suggestive that education is in part, maybe in large part, responsible for these differences that we'd identified.
Your study talks about the college income premium, and that the income premium, it's relevant and important for us to recognize that the income premium is changing and has changed over time. And my question is can you give us some insights about, one, the income premium, and also I think that sometimes when we talk about wealth and earnings, people kind of put those two things together, and those are also changing over time. Could you say a little bit about that?
Why don't I have Lowell make some comments on that?
Sure. Thanks, Charlie. That's a great question. I think I should start by defining what we mean by income premium. And really, we're looking at the average income or the average family wealth outcome of among four-year graduates or postgraduate families as compared to those families that lack a four-year degree or a postgraduate degree in the household. And this can include a broad group of families, those that, say, on the one end lack a high school diploma, and those on the other end that maybe attained an associate's degree. So this is a large group. There's a lot of diverse outcomes within that. But we're trying to understand the graduate family, the average family, how do they differ? How much more income might they expect to earn? How much more wealth might they expect to accumulate over time? And so that's how we define these premiums. And the income premium is typically around 2 times, or I think around 2 times is the maximum. And then the wealth premiums are much higher, 2 to 3 times among families. But a lot of the largest premiums are dominated by older families. Those, we break this out by the decade that they were born. And we see that a lot of the outsized premiums that are the conventional wisdom of college paying off come from the older cohorts. So the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s. Whereas those families born in the 1970s and 1980s have seen smaller wealth premiums or smaller income premiums to the point where we can't actually say they're that much different from families that don't have a college degree. And that's, I think, the really surprising finding. Now, you might say, well, these families are very young, so how can you really say that? Maybe it's just early on in their life cycle, so to speak, to borrow a term from economics. And we try to account for that as much as we can, in the fact that we're going to compare these families to similarly aged families at the same point in their life, but from different generations. And we're using data from the Federal Reserve Board's Survey of Consumer Finance, is often considered the gold standard of household balance sheet data. So what families own, what they owe, and what they earn. And it's been around, the modern version has been around since 1989. The most recent wave is 2016. And it comes out every 3 years. So we have about 10 years worth of data, and that's a little over 40,000 families. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So the conventional wisdom shows up. We see often that college graduates are out earning and out accumulating non-graduates, but there's a lot of diversity. You have to actually condition on when a family was born, their race and ethnicity, and the type of educational attainment, whether it's that 4-year degree or even higher, the postgraduate degree.
So I know that when you disaggregated your data, you looked at different racial groups and different, not comparing them across each other, but within the subcategories. And can you say a little bit about what your findings were with regards to that? Because that seems to me to relate a little bit to what you just said, Lowell, with regards to when you look back in time, greater wealth was accumulated in some categories and less in other categories that may have an influence on what their children are doing today. So I'm wondering, when you break the analysis down into the different groups, what were there any findings that struck you as being of interest that we should be paying special attention to. And I say that because we work primarily with low-income minority families, new immigrant families, and I see them struggling now to try to see the benefits of higher education. And yet you're saying the conditions under which they could advance right now are more difficult than they might have been 40 years ago.
Sure, I'd be happy to kind of go into the justification for breaking this out by race and ethnicity. And so much of our work, demographics of wealth, demographics of wealth series that Bill mentioned, and a lot of subsequent work looking at the returns of higher education by race and ethnicity, we found that you can't just simply treat race and ethnicity as a control in some of these methods. It's far too important, especially when it comes to wealth outcomes. We know that there are long historical exclusionary practices that have prevented families of color from accumulating wealth at the same level as white families. And when you're trying to use statistical models to understand this, some of the usual methods are insufficient. They can't capture how different the wealth outcomes are among these families. So to avoid that oversimplification on our part, we felt it was important to break this out by individual racial and ethnic groups, and those being white, non-Hispanic, Black, Hispanic of any race, and then another group that unfortunately, given the data, is as far we can disaggregate within that group. And the results were very interesting. What we found that within the Black families that within our sample, we found that the premiums, the income premium, or the wealth accumulation premium for those families born in the 1970s and those born in the 1980s were statistically insignificant. What does that mean? Well, we can't say they're fundamentally different from those families that did not earn the degree but were born in the same decade. So that was alarming, because when you compare that to white families, the wealth accumulation premium of those four-year grads was only insignificant for the 1980s group. So we're seeing weakness among the 1970s born Black families with similar educational attainment. And when you look at postgraduate degree holding families, we find insignificance even back to the 1960s cohort. So what do we think is going on? Well, our visiting scholar, Fenaba Otto at the University of Wisconsin, has highlighted the higher rates of financing for higher education among Black students. And we think this could really be a factor here.
Charlie, let me just jump in. So what Lowell has highlighted is really the novelty of our approach, is what Bill started us out on in this conversation, that we really focus on demographics and the importance of demographics. So just as an example, one of our other papers, an essay called The Demographics of Wealth, in which we looked at a respondent's education as well as their parents' education. So we actually found something that I thought was pretty shocking and really illustrated the power of demographics. So if we compared two middle-aged families, one white, who had parents with a four-year college degree or higher, but they themselves had not attained a four-year college degree. Now, if we compared their expected wealth to a family with more disadvantaged background characteristics, a Black family whose parents didn't have a four-year college degree, but they themselves actually did attain that four-year college degree, the wealth of the Black family was lower expected wealth than the white family who didn't attain the four-year college degree. So on the only demographic that they could control, their own education, the white family didn't have that four-year college degree, the Black family did, and yet the expected wealth, in part because of those background demographics that they don't have any control over, their race or ethnicity, their parents' education, we found that the white family still had an advantage. So I think that it really illustrates to me the importance of looking at a wide variety of demographic factors and controlling for that when possible.
Does that indicate that there are other societal factors that may be contributing to wealth accumulation in white families or white non-college graduates that may not be accessible to minority college graduates? I mean, I know that you're not supposed to hypothesize about things like that, but it sort of leads me to wonder what kinds of explanations do you have for those kinds of variations?
Well, as Anna was mentioning, we did find exactly that. So that those background factors, demographics, race or ethnicity here, and what I mentioned earlier, even the generation or the time period in which you're born,
Yes.
seem to make a difference. And we've been able to document that. I think, that's kind of it's powerful. It's also a little bit discouraging. As Anna said, you don't control your parents' level of education. You don't control when you're born. And so I guess, what I think that points toward is certainly from the research standpoint, being very aware that those factors are important, and possibly then, and of course, this is not our, what we do, but in terms of kind of policy responses, just being aware that those background factors are very, very powerful, and difficult for individuals to overcome. The other point, of course, is that wealth is somewhat different than income, in that wealth does have lots of reasons to believe that it's an intergenerational, it's a multi-generational project. And specifically for groups, for individuals and groups that, as Lowell said, have been excluded from wealth accumulation. That exclusion resulting in low wealth in the past has definite imprint on the current generation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously a very, very, very important observation with regards to, and again, I know that, although you're speaking for yourselves here, so you can do a little bit of policy discussions with me, but it seems as though to me, drawing on the point that we raised earlier, that if for low-income and minority families, because of the high cost of higher education and borrowing that they're doing, adversely affects their ability to accumulate wealth in the present time. So let's account for the fact that they may not have accumulated wealth in the past because of conditions that their parents dealt with. But today, just simply having a degree with debt is as problematic an issue for us to consider. So it would seem as though that as we look for potential strategies as we go forward, looking for instruments that could reduce debt for low-income and minority students as they pursue college degrees, and might get an income premium, but not have a wealth situation that they could benefit from it. So does that seem like a stretch of the imagination? Because I'm raising that because we have colleges and universities that are listening. I believe that these are incentives that they can use and consider when they're thinking about how best can we position all of our students to benefit from what society has to offer.
I think you're right. We've often talked about, and this paper does frame things in terms of generations. You're born in the 30s or 40s versus the 70s or 80s, as Lowell talked about. And it also has racial and ethnic dimensions, because those students born in the 1930s and 40s who show up in our data today are overwhelmingly white. And increasingly the student body is more diverse. And so partly what's going on with the younger generations, people born in the 70s and 80s, say, it's an increasingly diverse population. And getting back to your policy question, I think, speaking for myself, that it's really a social question of why are we forcing these later born generations to bear so much more of the cost of the education compared to what people born in the 1940s and 50s experienced, in many cases essentially free education, certainly not accumulating the kind of debt that younger groups are suffering from. So as I say, it's both a generational story, but it's also a racial and ethnic story.
Well, I think that your paper, which is, I think, one of the other additional values of the work that you've done, are bringing us back to the table to look at what are the social impacts for how we've structured the instruments for financing higher education in the world, in the country today. So whereas 30 or 40 years ago, it was like 70% grants and 30% loans. Now it's more like 80% grants and 80% loans and 10% grants. This has inverted the curve with regards to the amount of debt that this present generation is dealing with. And if you have parents who don't have wealth, who can help you pay that. So there's where the other variable that you've brought up, it becomes important, because if parents are paying for the kids to go to school, even though the larger macro socioeconomic structure is putting more cost on students, but if the parents can bear that cost, the students again become the beneficiary through instruments that the parents control versus instruments that the state or the institution control. So
Right.
this gives us a framework for us to talk about this, because in our work at Inversant, and many of the people that are listening to us today who are concerned about the changing demographic, we believe that this population is helpful to the economic vitality and future strength of the nation if we can equip these students with the tools and resources to take the jobs and career paths that are available to them. But this accumulated debt and fear of going to higher education because of debt becomes a very real concern for us. And I think your work is helping us to highlight that.
Thank you. Let me raise one possibility, and we have not done a lot of thinking or work on this topic, but one of the things that we think is really striking about this research is the distinction between income and wealth. As some of the numbers Lowell pointed out, the income benefits of college degrees and postgraduate degrees is true across all races and ethnicities.
Yes.
And while we think there has been a little bit of decline, a little bit of slippage as you look into the more recent generations, it's still very much positive for income, earning income.
Yes.
It's on the wealth accumulation where we see the more distressing trends, with declines in whatever race or ethnicity group you look at, and the most recent cohorts are have the weakest wealth accumulation. So my thought is, to the extent, and you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but to the extent that the FAFSA, or the financial aid process, is looking at income of the parent, and I know there is some consideration of wealth.
Yes.
It's possible that you might have, say, minority college graduate parents who are suffering from the legacy of being excluded, they and their parents and their parents' parents. So they have relatively high incomes because they have college degrees, but low wealth. And so, the idea here would be possibly these results would suggest maybe the formula for financial aid should look much more at wealth.
Yes.
Not exclusively or not primarily at income, because it's really the wealth dimension that has these very, very strong intergenerational linkages, much more so. And I think that also lines up with this idea that I give Lowell credit for coming up with this idea of the new calculus. It's very complicated, lots of moving pieces here. But as the more recent generations of college students are more diverse, will tend to be more affected by this legacy of either wealth, in some cases actually wealth stripping, but certainly not as much access to wealth accumulation. And so if we're thinking about how to target the students who have the most need, I would look more in the wealth dimension than the income of the parents.
I think that that's an excellent observation. And again, I say that this is, as we talked amongst ourselves about this was one of the striking characteristics that we felt was definitely a thread that we need to do additional work on. We do, in Massachusetts at least, are very much involved in discussions with folks who are concerned about how do we better position all members of our state to be able to participate fully in the richness of our economy and the quality of life that we want to, in the institutional and community change that we're looking to facilitate through higher education. But if we are not looking at the kind of more granular issues that you're raising, I think it makes it harder for us to execute the kinds of policies that can be helpful. In this, your research, I think, again, points us in very, very thoughtful directions. I wanted to, if I could just quickly turn to something that we talked about before we went on air, and that is, the methodological approaches that you used in to get the tools to be able to look at things the way in which you've done. And could you say, not to deeply involved in all the work that your accumulated knowledge has resulted in with all the degrees and expertise that you have. But can you give us sort of a layman's perspective on how and why the data, deep data analytics were so important in helping you disaggregate this so that we could understand what we're looking at?
Sure, I'll jump in, Charlie. So I think it's important to have as much disaggregation. And what do we mean by that? Well, instead of just looking at all families within the survey of consumer finances that have a college degree and compare them to all families that don't, if you do that, you find that there's an incredible return to college. And it really hasn't fluctuated much. We see it in wealth, we see it in income, but it's only after you dig deeper. And then you start to break out all families by race and ethnicity. You break out, well, is it a 4-year degree? Is it a postgraduate degree? And you break out when they were born. And all these factors lead to a lot better picture on which families are driving that overall return that is so phenomenal. These are some of the families that are older, born in earlier decades, precisely because of the points that Bill raised, in which the cost of higher education was much lower. And you made the point that they had a lot more grant access. They didn't need to finance it as much because of that. And so this is where the generational story starts to come out and is so important to our results, because when we look at those families born in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, compared to the younger generations, that's when we see, I think, the departure of these returns. And so that's I think one of the key points of this work is it tries to dig deeper into that. Some of the things we can't speak to in the survey of consumer finances data, which are important, as other research shows, is the type of institution these families attended, whether that be private or public, 4-year or for-profit, and the type of major. So we don't quite know what they studied. And we know that there's a broad range of different incomes and potential wealth accumulation associated with those factors. So I just want to identify the caveat there. But overall, we use pretty standard research methods. For those on the call that might be a little bit more familiar with these concepts, it's a simple regression method. And we try to also account for age, because we know outcomes vary as you age, as the life cycle of wealth. When you're young, you might have had to borrow for higher education. You might be just starting out in the labor market. And as they age and grow older, they're able to pay down that debt. This is the ideal scenario, the theoretical. Obviously, the lived experience can vary quite a bit. But as you grow older, you earn more and are able to accumulate some wealth through savings and other means. And so we wanted to account for that, because so much of wealth outcomes depend on this life cycle. And so we included that in our models. So that's a little bit of kind of a high level take on the disaggregation and some of the nuances of the data.
Yeah, I think that that's very helpful. Thank you very much, Lowell. I appreciated that very much, and I'm sure members in our listening audience did as well. Right now in the U.S., we're seeing a significant migration of people coming to the country, and we're seeing people whose families have no historical background in the United States, who are looking at higher education as a potential pathway for opportunity for them. And talking now the large and growing and burgeoning Latino population in the United States. But if we look at the circumstances which you're identifying, which is larger amounts of debt to pursue their higher education. So won't those be somewhat of a drag on their ability to kind of accumulate wealth and be able to get into the middle class and mainstream of what they will? Won't it delay the opportunities and the timeline by which that can happen if the debt burden and cost for degree completion is higher now than it might have been for other generations and other populations in the country?
So I think one of the things that we always like to mention, because there's this great debate in public interest in student loan debt, right? The rising huge issue of student loan debt. But we kind of try to steer people towards what we see as more the root cause, which is, as you just mentioned, Charlie, the rising cost of college. So college since 1978 has risen by 14 times, whereas the cost of other goods and services has risen about 4 times as much. Right. So you can see that if it were to be equal, it'd be 4 to 4, but it's 4 to 14. So college has really skyrocketed, the cost of college. So whether or not you have to take out debt, you still have to pay for that greater cost, right? So it's drawing down wealth either way. So that's really what we see as a root cause. Now, in terms of student loan debt and that delaying major life milestones, we haven't done research personally on that, but Sandra Black is a scholar who recently came out with a paper looking at this, and she found, lumping everyone together, so we know our issues with that, right? Not disaggregating by race or ethnicity, but she found that if people were able to take out more debt, and these are federal loans, so fairly small numbers, but that actually increased for 4-year college grads or 4-year college goers their ability to complete the degree, and it didn't have an effect on things like home ownership. So in that sense, from that research, it didn't really seem that it was having access to student loans in order to fulfill that college education. It didn't seem negative from that aspect, but as Bill said, while income has held relatively steady, we haven't seen the same thing for wealth. Wealth has decreased. So I bet if they were to break down their results by race and ethnicity, we would possibly see divergences there. And we know that Black families have to take out student loan debt at higher rates, and their levels, their loan balances are also higher than for white families. So that just speaks again to the importance of disaggregating by different races and ethnicities for this work.
Let me ask Anna a question. If you recall, you did some work looking at the intergenerational persistence of college attainment.
Right.
I think you had, maybe you can't remember all that off the top of your head, but I thought you had seen that there were some differences in persistence of, maybe you can explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what Bill is referring to, we mean persistence intergenerationally. So if a parent were to get a 4-year college degree or more, what's the likelihood that their adult child who's a respondent in the survey would also have a 4-year college degree? And so for whites and for the other catch-all group that Lowell was referring to earlier, there were decent levels of intergenerational persistence, but for Blacks and Hispanics, levels were much lower. And Hispanics actually have the poorest levels of intergenerational persistence. On the flip side, if their parents didn't have a 4-year college degree, so in other words, they would be potentially first gen, it was very unlikely that they would complete that 4-year college degree. So I believe for Hispanics, it was only 10% of those who didn't have parents with college degrees actually got a college degree themselves, so were first gen. So I think this really speaks to what we've termed the stickiness of education between generations, that it's easier to, perhaps because of various things, not just financial help that your parents may be able to afford to you, but also just intergenerational know-how. So they know this is when you should register for classes. This is the type of major maybe you should be pursuing. You should go to office hours. Those are types of things that students without parents who have gone through college, who have gotten that 4-year degree, they can't rely on their parents for that help. So it becomes more difficult for them to complete a degree.
Your statement is usually the point where I make a commercial about what we do in Inversant, because that is actually at the heart of what it is that we as an organization have been concerned about and what we're dedicated to, because we believe that parents have high aspirations for their children. If you we find that when we talk to low-income families, new immigrant families, the parents will tell us what they want for their children. We want my son or daughter to go to college. We want them to have a better life than I had. We came to this country with the expectation that this would be an opportunity for us to lift ourselves up and to live a better lifestyle. But yet, without the information about this and without the supports for them to actualize those aspirations, to transform them into expectations, the data that you just suggested will be true. I don't know anyone who ever went to college. I don't really think it'll work for my son or daughter. So those support structures, we think, are absolutely vital to fill the gap that those parents who didn't get a higher education don't have, and they need some other structure within our society that can help make that happen. So again, I'm turning to your research to say that it's giving us more insights in the type of work that we need to be doing in the country right now to recognize that there's many benefits that higher education can play, but unless we understand what's underneath it and keeping that from being a successful pathway, we're not going to really fully maximize that in the country. So thank you very much for that observation and for giving me an opening door to make a commercial about Inversant.
Right.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think it brings up something that Lowell has hinted on, and I always like to mention during talks with people that aren't familiar with our work, and that there's a lot of variety, right? We're talking about averages, or we're talking about people in the median, the 50th percentile, but the distribution is very broad. So we're not saying, we're not trying to dissuade people who are perhaps minorities or first generation from going to college because, even if we have seen returns on wealth, for example, decrease across generations, that's not to say that one specific family or one specific person isn't going to have more favorable outcomes. And so that's certainly not something that we advocate and saying, no, you shouldn't think about going to college. We just say that, you need to be really careful about thinking about things because the situation is different than it was perhaps in the past.
And let me circle back to something you said at the very beginning, Charlie. We're very aware these results only speak to the dollars and cents of the income that you earn and the wealth that you've accumulated. And it's specifically just this one generation. But this whole conversation about the intergenerational or multi-generational nature of educational persistence, wealth accumulation, achieving upward mobility, the American dream, whatever you want to call it, something that we have thought about, and we don't really have a good way to measure that. But part of the benefit of, say, becoming a first generation college graduate yourself is that then you can provide help in navigating this hidden curriculum that Anna was talking about to your own children.
Yes.
So it really is, and I think that if we could impress upon, and I'm sure you do that, impress upon people that this is an investment not only in yourself, but in your family and in your children in helping them potentially in the future.
Yeah, I think that's, again, part of the messaging that we're going to be taking out of this conversation, which again, I want to compliment and thank you all for your work, but you're giving us ways of thinking about how we should be communicating to the families and communities and policy people that we talk with on a day-to-day basis about what's the landscape look like right now, not what we're hypothesizing and blue skying with regards to the situation looks like. What is the reality of what it is the research and the data is telling us the conditions are right now? And I think as we just heard, I was in a conversation recently, there's been a precipitous decline in the number of students that are filling out the FAFSA in Massachusetts. And so that to me makes me feel that more students are concerned about going on to higher ed. They're uncertain about what that future might hold for them. So what kinds of things, and I think we should be saying to those students about why they should complete those FAFSA, and what are we trying to do to help ameliorate the fears that they have about, and I have to say it, debt seems to be the biggest variable that's impacting the decisions that they're making. What kinds of things can we say that we're doing to address that? And I keep wanting to throw you guys into making policy statements, but I know that you can't to a certain extent. But it seems as though to me that it's important for us to recognize that as we're talking with the folks that we talk with, that we need to recognize that we're going to have even greater problems as we look to the future in our higher education sector if we don't come to some better understanding and better strategy for how we're thinking about higher ed, who should be going, and how we're supporting them when they get there. And it seems as though to me that I'm going to have to say it, going in the wrong direction right now by putting more and more debt on students and looking for them as the solution for facilitating the operations of our colleges and not looking in other sectors. And that is a very big policy discussion. I think 30 or 40 years ago, we looked at higher education as a social benefit that society at large benefited. And today we've kind of turned more towards this as an individual benefit. It helps the individual consumer of higher ed, and it doesn't benefit the broader society. So therefore, let's let the individual bear the cost. But it seems though to me that society does pay a cost. There is a cost to society by the lack of productivity and lack of energy and intelligence that we bring to dealing with our broader concerns if we're not educating our population.
Right. Well, I think this is one of the things that economists and other social scientists would agree almost 100%, I think, across the board, is that it does have social value in addition to having the personal benefits that people can obtain. I mean, it's so obvious that we all benefit from a more educated population. And Anna mentioned those cost comparisons. And, you know, I've heard people argue from the public side or the private side, no, the cost increase is really being driven by the publics. No, it's being driven by the privates. I don't know what the right answer is, but in terms of the overall magnitudes, I think the public support for education is more critical just because so many more people go to public institutions. And as we are at this moment in an enormous fiscal crisis for states and local governments, we are, I'm afraid to say, at risk of making this situation even worse. In budget crises at the state level, if they haven't already, probably very soon will translate into pressure on funding for higher education, as well as other, local governments are going to be facing financial stress in supporting primary and secondary education. And I say, especially the three of us who've been looking at this a lot, but I think even people who are not specialists in this area just understand how important education is. And at some level, it's just incredible that we don't have broader public support for it. I think sometimes, speaking for myself, sometimes the debate gets, taken down a path for other reasons, whether it's, anti-tax sentiment or even sometimes more nefarious, the boat is full, I don't want to pay for somebody else's kids. Mm-hmm. But it's so short-sighted not to be thinking about investing heavily and not just maintaining, which we're not even doing, but increasing the investments and making sure, and that's, I think, what this work really points to, is that access and affordability of those opportunities is not what it was before. And, that's sort of our overall, I think, story is that people are a little bit blinded by the aggregate statistics that say that the personal value of education is so high. I'm not worried about the cost of going to college. It pays for itself. But what we're saying is that's not a full picture of what's happening. It differs by when you're born, your racial or ethnic, your family's wealth situation. And it's a terrible waste for society not to be making those opportunities for people to invest in their own human capital, which has so many spin-offs, benefits for everyone.
Well, I think, first of all, thank you very much for that statement. I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people who are listening, many who are in higher education administration and are looking at their own institutions, other policy experts who are listening who recognize that the direction in which we're heading right now is problematic and we have to think about a pathway forward. And I think also for those who are in public higher education, I spent 31 years of my life in higher education administration at the University of Massachusetts. And your argument is exactly the one that I have been making for most of my adult life, which is to say that if we do not and cannot provide this to our public education system, there is a cost for not educating people. There's a cost for poverty. There are so many costs that we are bearing as a country as a result of our failure to recognize that lifting people up in our democracy is a much better way for us to move forward than having a system that picks and chooses and lets other people fall by the wayside. And I think higher education has a special role to play. And I believe that your work will give us a deeper vocabulary, a deeper way of thinking about how we can approach these issues. And I want to again say that I think the idea that we need to have a deeper conversation in the policy arena about where we are right now. And I think that's eluding people, because the big picture looks very good. I think most people think higher education is working great. We're benefiting from it. There are no problems. And I think that's where a little more granular look at the situation might be helpful. Looking forward, which is always dangerous to do. If we look forward, how do we move the needle on some of these issues that we're talking about? Does this now become greater work in a broader policy discussion? I think even next week you're going to be meeting with people in the Black colleges, HBCUs, to have a discussion about this.
Yeah.
Do you think it's required to have more conversations in broader forums in order to get more people on board on where we are right now to sort of move the needle in a different direction?
I think yes. In doing this work, we did have conversations, saying, well, this could be discouraging, some of these results. And I think Lowell and Anna both mentioned, that the message is not that kids for whom college is the right track, and not everybody is going to go to college, and nor should they, but for the kids for whom that's the right track, I think we've isolated is that there are sort of these disadvantages that some people are facing. And so the message is really not only or specifically to the kids and their families, but it's to the broader, as you said, the broader higher education community, the broader society, that we all agree that this is the right thing to provide opportunities for higher education to those for whom it's the right thing, and we're falling down, and that's really the message that we're trying to bring.
And have you had much occasion in that context? Have you had much occasion to talk with higher education leaders about this? I mean, are college presidents asking you to convene with them to have a discussion about your research and how that might help them think about strategies going forward with regards to their institutions?
No, I would say, and we've had a little bit of interaction with representatives of universities or people who study colleges, and I think this is not a very welcome message, I think, because you can read this work as being critical. Anna's 14 times versus 4 times
yes
rising cost. So you could read this as a fairly pointed criticism that these institutions are possibly even exacerbating wealth inequality in the United States. Because for those families that have advantages, historical advantages, educated parents, wealthy parents, the system works fine. It's expensive, but they can afford it.
yes
Whereas those with less advantage are unable to accumulate wealth to the same extent, or in some cases can't even finish the degree because of the financial pressures. So I think that's one interpretation why this is not a message that higher education leaders have necessarily embraced.
And I'll just add a personal anecdote on that. So when I was a freshman in college, we had to take I'll call it a diversity course. It was required. And one of the things that was just basically a one-liner in one class in this course was the distribution of parental income for the students. And I remember, I filled out the FAFSA, and of course it primarily focuses on income, and I didn't get a whole lot because my parents are college educated. They had to find income, but we're also Hispanic and we didn't have a lot of wealth. But that aside, so I was like, okay, well, knowing now what I know, not before, but my parents have a fairly normal income.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found shocking was the majority of students, their parents had household incomes over $200,000, which is not normal. It's not the median. It's not the typical in the United States, but the vast majority of students have that income. And I think that's, I went to a private four-year college, and that's more common in those types of universities. But I think it's just leaving a lot of people and a lot of talent behind if colleges and universities aren't looking to actively recruit first-gen students whose parents maybe have lower income, lower wealth.
Well, I mean, you are all. Thank you very much for that statement, Anna. I think that's the reality that many students are seeing and experiencing. I was going to raise the question that, as economists, you in a capitalistic system that we have here, wouldn't you presume that the kinds of realities that you're talking about right now will cause corrections in the system? Aren't institutions going to have to adjust to the realities that are on the ground? They're seeing enrollments declining. They're seeing the changing demographics and the lack of disaccumulated wealth. Somehow or another, that's going to lead to deeper conversations about how we can restructure the financial operations of our institutions. Would you think that that's beyond the realm of reasonable thinking?
Well, I think it's beyond economics. I think you're talking about political science and sociology. I mean, how do we make these decisions? I will throw out that, the United States is not the only model of higher education. And to generalize, there is, kind of a Northern European or more broadly a European model where access to higher education is either free or very low cost.
Yes.
And the intergenerational, or rather the bargain that we are asking people to enter is that your education is free, and then when you earn more, we will tax you at a higher rate.
Yeah,
so the idea that we have very easy access to make sure that no young person who has an aptitude and an interest in higher education will be denied for financial reasons. And then the payback comes when you benefit from that privately. You share those benefits with society through higher tax rates. And I think in the United States, we have kind of the reverse. We have raised the price of admission and cut tax rates later.
Yes.
And it really, if the European is more of a socially conscious or, sharing the benefits and costs across society, I think in the US, we have gone in the other direction. And as you said, made it much more of a private endeavor. It's more like, each family is kind of on your own. If you are able to reap those big benefits of higher education, we're going to tax you at very low rates compared to other countries. And so you get to keep those benefits. And I think by my descriptions, you probably can guess which way I would prefer we would go. But that would involve major changes in really in our whole thinking about taxes and burden sharing and the social benefits of education.
Well, I mean, I don't think that we're going to have those major conversations unless we have a kind of an analysis at the macro level on how the position and structure that we're in right now, what the implications of that are for our society and for the people in our society. And I think most policy makers, I believe, would be and will be quite concerned as they become more knowledgeable of what the landscape is looking like right now, as we're looking more in a more fine-tuned manner on what some of the challenges are and how it's affecting our ability in the talent pipeline. I mean, how can we continue to compete in the global context when we are not producing the kind of talent from our colleges and universities that we need in order for that to happen? Those are just simple questions that a layperson would have. And for most of the people that I work with and we work with in the agencies and organizations that are college access and opportunity, that's the case that we're making. We're saying that we believe that the jobs and the careers are available to you, that the country needs you in order to be well educated, in order to help maintain the quality and standard of living to which we all want to aspire to and enjoy in the country. If you're not, I mean, so I'm saying that only to say that those are conversations that I think that can, in fact, help us move the needle. And I do think that some of our college and university leaders, when confronted with the reality of the data, you can't overnight just change the structure, but it didn't take us overnight to get to where we are right now. We just have to start moving in a somewhat different direction.
Right. Yeah, I think it's possible that, you and I, Charlie, our generation, we are the big beneficiaries of this system, the very, very low cost and the huge benefits we've obtained. And our colleagues, Lowell and Anna, being in a younger generation, they're experiencing it firsthand. They and their siblings and their friends bearing this tremendous cost of higher education. And, I hope that we could do something before we exit the scene. But, I think the younger, the lived experience of people who have seen this system, who've experienced how difficult it is to manage it, to navigate it, maybe we'll have more success in making those changes.
Well, I certainly think that the paper, the exercises that you're taking right now, moving around the country and talking with people about these issues and giving some deeper insights into how it's playing out, as you said, in the lived experiences of people, is extremely important. I do think that research is driving a lot more policy making than we might realize. And I think that for those of us who are in the Inversant community and Inversant family, I think that your work is absolutely so valuable to us in helping us think about what we should be thinking about and the direction in which we want to travel. As well, I want to say, on another conversation that we might have going forward in with people that are on the call as well, just further thought about this strategies for dealing with college financing and student debt is a very, very big issue with us. We have a whole organization within our family of programs that's looking at that issue. And there's some things we'd like to talk with you about further about that, and your thoughts and perhaps some of your analysis on some ideas that we have that might fall directly in your areas of expertise. We're getting down to, I think, close to a minute to be in our full hour. I want to say to everyone who's listening, I know everyone is applauding you. I am as well right here to say thank you very much, Lowell and Anna and William, for a very lively, thoughtful, engaging conversation. You are brilliant scholars. I want to thank also the people at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And that's St. Louis, not Boston. I have a Boston-centric orientation to the world, so you have to forgive me for that. But it's so great to see the wonderful work that you're doing. If you have any closing remarks to make, this would be a good chance for you to do it.
I'll just say that, it's been really exciting to do this work, and the response we've gotten has been very encouraging. So, we're open to those times of comments and remarks. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any other follow-up questions.
We're willing to do that. Lowell, do you have anything to say in closing?
I just want to thank you, Charlie, and the entire Inversant family for letting us share this work with you. And I'll just raise the specter of the current crisis that we're in. Higher education in particular is dealing with a historic challenge in this fall semester. So I think that's going to be incredibly impactful in the short term, but it'll be important to look at the long-term consequences.
That's right. I mean, the issues we talked about were important, and yet we're in a moment with really unfathomable challenges, and it's going to be tough to figure this out.
William, I want to say I think this is your team, some of your team members here. I want to thank you for bringing together such a wonderful group of young people. I'm old enough to say young people. I hope the two of us will continue to do as much as we can as the other generation. But your work has been spectacular. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us. For everyone who's been listening, I want you to know that this conversation is ongoing. Please write us, text us, Facebook us, whatever you need to do to let us know what your thoughts are. We'll continue this conversation. And I do want to thank your team for your insights and for your support of such an important discussion in the country. I can't tell you how important what it is that you've done is for where we are right now. With that, let me say thank you all to everyone who's been listening. We will be back again for another conversation soon. We'll let you know when that happens. But until then, be well, take care of yourself, and we look forward to talking with you next month.